Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and it's time for In the News, our regular look at the news stories that we've been watching, reading over the past couple of weeks. So with me today is Adrian Reynolds, our Head of National Ministries.
Hello, it's the first time this year for the news. So
it is for In the News, yeah. If you didn't listen last week, happy New Year. John Stevens here, our National Director as well.
Hi, Phil.
Good morning, John. Good to see you. Well, one story has dominated this week. The BBC have done their own little section about it, and that is Prince Harry's book, Spare.
Has he written a book?
He's written a book. Have you got your copies?
I haven't.
No, me neither. John?
No,
you haven't. But lots has been written about this, hasn't
I feel
it?
that everything I'd want to read about in the book, I've already read about.
Yeah, in terms of all the things that were trailed and the way it was leaked in Spain and all that kind of thing. Yeah. What do we make of it, first of all, as a kind of a tell-all memoir? He's clearly been encouraged to do this. People have advised him this was a good idea. Was it?
I think the starting point has got to be it's terribly sad to sort of see the breakdown of relationships within the royal family. So clearly there's been a massive breakdown of relationship between Harry and William. I think for a number of years, people saw them as brothers who were quite close together. We know that there was a sort of a leaving of the royal family and going to California, but the depth of the kind of breakdown of that relationship between them is tragic to read and hear about.
So privilege doesn't immunise you from the same challenges that lots of people face.
Lots of families have. Yeah. But the most interesting revelation for me was that the Prince and Princess of Wales are fans of Suits that Meghan Markle starred in. That's kind of been lost, but that is an extraordinary revelation. So there is a brilliant thing in the final season of Suits where they've written Rachel Zane, who was Meghan Markle's character, out of the show because she's gone to marry Prince Harry. And her on-screen husband just says, as a little aside, "You wouldn't believe how well she's doing," which is just brilliant. But yeah, that is really interesting. But those kind of little human elements have just been completely overshadowed, as you say, by all the kind of breakdown and the difficulty. Is there any way, do you think, for reconciliation to happen there? I mean, will Harry come to the coronation of King Charles III next year or later this year?
Well, the reports are that he's been invited to come. Some people have said that he shouldn't. Harry himself has said that he wants reconciliation with the King and with Prince William, and he's open to that. He obviously feels that he's been treated really badly, that Meghan has been treated really badly. At one level, there's an outpouring of hurt here in the book, and you can sense that deep sense of kind of pain. You can feel that sort of sense of, obviously, the difficulty of being the younger member of the royal family. I think the title Spare says it all. Yeah. And history shows how difficult it is to be the one who's the second child. I mean, you can look at the kind of Princess Margaret, Prince Andrew, Prince Harry. It's a very difficult situation because you're born into this position of immense privilege, very close to the throne. But as you grow up, you inevitably become more and more distanced. As the one who is older than you marries, has children, they become more prominent. So, I mean, all of that is part of the mix of the immense hurt that is felt there. I mean, whether it's right or helpful to pour out your hurt in that way is a different question. And he says he wants reconciliation, but you might say that pouring out all of those things, breaking confidences, speaking about the life of the royal family is just going to make that more and more difficult. It's exacerbated the division. Of course, there is always hope for reconciliation. I mean, the Bible is actually full of stories of siblings where the relationship breaks down because of rivalry and jealousy. I mean, of course, that starts with Cain and Abel, the first murder in the Bible. We might think of Jacob and Esau. We might think of Joseph and his brothers. We might think of Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. So kind of a breaking down of sibling relationships is a very common feature of being in a fallen world and the rivalry that siblings have with each other. Now, I think we can hold out the hope that there can be real reconciliation. So some of those stories end in wonderful reconciliations. Jacob and Esau are reconciled ultimately to each other after many years. Actually, they run together, they kiss, they embrace. And in some ways, that's picked up in the picture of the prodigal son, with the way the father embraces the prodigal son who comes home. Of course, Joseph ultimately is reconciled to his brothers in a remarkable way. So the grace of the gospel, the grace of God, makes reconciliation possible. But in order for that to be the case, there needs to be a repentance and a coming together. And I think Prince Harry has almost put it, I want reconciliation, but only on my terms, only if there's an acknowledging of the fault that's been done. And it feels as though he's presenting himself as exclusively the victim and the others as the perpetrators. And I think in so many cases of broken down relationships, that's exactly the way that people think. They think of themselves as the victim and the other person is the one who has to do the reconciling, rather than seeing that maybe there's an element of failing on both parts if there's to be a true kind of reconciliation. I come back to the prodigal son, that in the end, both the younger brother and the older brother were both in need of reconciliation. They'd both failed in different ways. So reconciliation is possible, but at a human level, that of course is only likely to be the case if people recognise their mutual fault and are prepared to exercise kind of forgiveness. Of course, it's completely different in relation to God. Because in our reconciliation with God, it really is one-sided. We are the ones who have offended God, failed to live up to his standards, failed to treat him as he deserves to be treated as our creator. And actually, the reconciliation comes from his side. He takes the initiative to reach out to us. And it's us who need to be kind of, in a sense, reconciled. It's our sin that needs to be dealt with. So in most human relationships, there's a mutuality of sin that needs to be dealt with. In relation to God, he has taken on the task of bringing out the reconciliation when all the fault is ours. But that, in a sense, provides the paradigm from which we can reconcile when we're mutually at fault.
Phil, a couple of things occurred to me on this story. One that came to me last night, as Celia and I were running some marriage prep classes for someone who used to be in our church online. And we were talking about the end of Genesis 2, about how when a marriage happens, a new family unit is created. Man leaves his mother and father and unites to his wife. And I think part of the challenge, it seems to me, in the Harry-Meghan story is Meghan having to sort of fit into a very strong, structured family organisation. I mean, they call it the firm, don't they? And really struggling with that, understandably. And I think we can put a load on marriages where there are strong family units that already exist. So actually, I think it's really important that when we speak to married couples, we say you don't stop being a child of your parents. You still have to honour your parents, but actually, your primary loyalty and relationship is now in the new family unit, which is your spouse. And I think we've got to think more about that, and especially actually in marriages. In marriages where there is a sort of one-sided. So where perhaps a man comes from a family which is fairly loose and not particularly close, but a wife comes from a very, very close-knit family, or vice versa. That can bring a strain on a marriage, which I think is what we're seeing evidenced a little bit in Harry and Meghan. That's one observation. The second one isn't it extraordinary how much people love gossip? So I think, why are people reading this book and buying it? Joel, our producer man, comms guy, was just
sneezing in the background.
He's sneezing in the background, coughing, and he was just telling us that spreading COVID, no doubt. He was just telling us that in terms of the best-selling book, in one day it would have been in the top 10 of last year's best-selling books. Why are people reading it? Is it because they're feeling sorry, Harry, or they want to know the story? I think people want the gossip, which is why when the papers publish excerpts, they go straight for the juicy bits. Who said this? Who was it that made that comment about their what colour skin their child would have? That's the stuff they want, and I think it just reveals that there is an insatiable appetite for gossip. And it's interesting that the New Testament highlights that as something that we need to fight against, and that shouldn't be amongst us. So I think it just reveals something not only of the challenge of marriage, but actually something of our own hearts, how we love the gossip.
I always remember a girl coming over from America to our university, and she was in the Christian Union with us, and that was something she pointed out. She couldn't believe the number of gossip magazines basically that were on sale in the newsagents. She was astonished by it. Evidently 20 years ago that wasn't to the same level in the United States, and she was absolutely appalled by it for just the reasons that you've outlined. There is this insatiable appetite for it. There seems to be in our culture.
Just a couple of things. I think one thing that we can take from it is how easy it is to become self-righteous and think that your position is the one that's only right. I think, Prince Harry has written this book, I'm sure, expecting to gain a large measure of public sympathy. What's been really striking is that there seems to be a reaction against him.
Yes, there's a survey here today that actually his popularity has dropped to an all-time low. Which is extraordinary, just a few days after the book's published. People are reacting against it.
He was probably hoping to be vindicated, to be seen as the victim, for people to turn against the royal family. And actually that isn't what happens. In many ways, it's been the other way around. And again, we can become blind to our own hypocrisy in those kinds of situations. People have pointed out that one of the things that he says in the book is he kind of rails against Paul Burrell, Princess Diana's former kind of butler, for writing a tell-all kind of memoir, which basically, divulged all sorts of stories. And that obviously deeply angered him. And his anger at the British press and the tabloids and the way that stories have been sort of run about him and his family and his mother. And yet at the same time in the book, he's done exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And that is so often the case, isn't it, actually, that those who even often are genuine victims end up sort of inadvertently often doing the very same things that they are accusing others of doing. And we become blind to that in our own self-righteousness. And the gospel and the Bible calls us to examine our own hearts and to recognize that very often we're not solely victims. We're not perfectly righteous in the way that we might think we are.
So we've talked about one man, Prince Harry. Let's talk about a different man, but still a man who's been in the news this last 10 days or so. This is a chap called Andrew Tate. Have you come across this guy? So arrested in Romania, a kind of social media influencer, a self-defined misogynist. Who basically believes that women should be subject to men, apparently causing chaos in our schools with young boys following his social media platforms and wanting to be like him. He presents a very glamorous image of his particular take on society. First thing to say, obviously, we've got to offer a better solution than that as Christians. But how do we respond to a man like this who's influencing, it seems, so many, particularly of our young boys?
It's also worth saying, by the way, he's a nasty pornographer.
Right.
So the stuff that's often comes out online is, that he's, a right-wing misogynist, but actually he's a lot worse than that. And some of the things he's been arrested for are really quite not very nice, in terms of trafficking women and having them perform in front of webcams and things like that. So it's a pretty sordid story. He's a pretty sordid man. I think what strikes me about it really is a number of things, but I think especially the power of social media to promote such people. I just think that's very striking, isn't it? That actually he's got a platform very quickly and very easily, and actually even when he's been banned from social media, he still finds a way around the ban. And I think it is a reminder that if people want to access extreme material, they will find it, and they can find it. I have a problem with anybody self-styling, I think. It seems to me that our identity is governed by Scripture. It's laid out in Scripture. God creates us in a certain way to be certain people, to work in a certain way. And in fact, whether you go into Old Testament law or you go into New Testament epistles, by any measure, his behaviour is well outside of that standard. But it does show that people are searching for identity.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is, why are so many young men attracted to this? And it really does reveal something of a cultural problem about young men, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about the culture that they're in. And that's not to defend him at all. I mean, he's an appalling misogynist. But I think there's a whole generation of young men who lack purpose, who are fearful for the future. They've seen sort of women and girls overtake them in just about every area of life. So educationally, in terms of opportunity, the constant narrative of our culture is that sort of men are a problem. And actually that's embedded just in all sorts of different kind of cultural reflections. And it's not surprising that therefore young men are desperate for something that gives them kind of meaning, validation, significance. It's tragic that this is what they're looking to. But I do think there's been, as a result of the kind of sexual revolution, the rise of feminism, a right desire to want to deal with issues of ways in which women might have been discriminated against and held back. It's not been wrong to deal with that, but many have neglected the reality of the situation of men, particularly young men from a poorer background, are the most disadvantaged group. And yet in our society, nobody ever seems to speak about that. The assumption is still that it's women in general, girls in general, who are somehow held back and the system is rigged against them. Whereas actually all of the statistics are that it's white young men from a working class background who are the most disadvantaged in society. And it is therefore tragic that they are looking to this as a way of finding validation. They're offering, it seems to me, a lifestyle of wealth obtained easily without hard work. So their hustle university is about ways of making huge amounts of money kind of easily. Their sort of view of women is that women are there to serve you, and that's just indulging the worst of kind of fallen male sexual kind of desires and legitimating it and identifying that as true masculinity. And literally millions of young teenage boys are listening to this. I do think it's part of the much bigger problem of pornography in our society. Pornography which has become ubiquitous, in which women are reduced to objects who are to be exploited. There's increasing evidence that pornography is increasingly violent. It justifies the abuse of women. And again, many of our young men are from a very early stage of their lives watching pornography like that, which is shaping the way that they view kind of women. I read a fascinating book over Christmas. It was published last year, but I think it's Laura Perry, called about the sexual revolution, the failure of the sort of sexual revolution, which basically says that sort of one of the consequences of the sexual revolution is far too often what it's done is simply provide a justification for men to fulfill their misogynistic, exploitative desires, and that women have not been protected, but have been encouraged on the basis of kind of freedom and choice and consent, simply to indulge to those kind of male desires, particularly in pornography and prostitution, in allowing themselves to be sort of brutalized in relationships. And I think there's a large measure of truth to that. And the Bible would say that is utterly wrong. This is not the way that the Bible teaches that men and women should relate to one another. And there have been, some Christians who are patriarchal and have taught a kind of a female submission to men that's not miles away from what Andrew Tate seems to sort of teach. But that isn't the biblical position of how men and women should relate to one another. Men are given a responsibility to protect, to care, to serve, to love. The biblical paradigm of marriage, based on the relationship between Jesus of the church, is of the husband who lovingly cares for his wife, provides for her, enables her to flourish and to become the woman of God that she was created to be. It's a loving commitment. And inevitably, what that means is people have to fight their sinful desires, their fallen flesh. Not all of our desires are good. And we were looking at the kind of book of Jude the other day, and it talks there about our natural instincts, which are not a good thing, but are often a very bad thing that need to be kind of repressed and kind of reformed. So this is so far from the biblical picture of how men and women should relate to one another. And we need to give a much more noble kind of vision of what it means to be a man, how to treat women rightly and properly, modelled on the example of the Lord Jesus and the way that he treated kind of women in his ministry, which is then reflected in the New Testament teaching.
The book is Louise Perry.
I'm sorry.
The Case Against the Sexual Revolution.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's move on. We need to talk about politics. Politics is back up and running after the Christmas break, but crisis to crisis, I think, for our Prime Minister.
Which one do you want?
Well, I think we should just mention cost of living crisis.
Yes, good news there, because we often talk about the cost of living crisis and how bad things are. Wholesale gas prices, which hopefully will eventually knock through to retail gas prices. Wholesale gas prices at their lowest level since before the Ukrainian crisis began. So that's really good news. And hopefully that will provide some alleviation down the line. And
some evidence that the economy grew in November,
that's right.
which is actually surprising everybody.
Yeah. Well, so maybe a couple of
nuggets. That's all the Christmas presents I bought you.
Yes. But we do seem to have, and this isn't just linked to strikes, but we do seem to have a crisis in the NHS, which I think is worth touching upon. It seems to be the case in all nations. So the Conservatives running England, the SNP running Scotland, Labour running Wales, but this crisis seems to be systemic across the National Health Service in one way or another. People waiting for beds, ambulances queuing, and the like. This does seem to me, I think I said to you yesterday, John, I feel nervous to get ill at the moment. It does feel quite troubling. How do we respond to this? How do we help our churches and our people think wisely about this?
Well, I think as well, there does seem to be a crisis. The system seems to be overwhelmed. I mean, all the figures of the amount of time that people are spending in A&E, increased excess death rates. There are a whole variety of factors that are contributing to that. There's obviously some of the consequences of COVID and lockdown, undiagnosed and untreated conditions. I think the bigger problem is of an ageing population in which more and more people are experiencing illness and suffering kind of chronic illness that lasts for a long period of time. So it's linked to the absence of social care and the inability to discharge people from
so beds are blocked, aren't they? People could be elsewhere, but yeah.
So essentially we have a massive problem of a population that is aging, that is increasingly ill, and a system that's not able to cope with that. I think we ought to have gratefulness for the staff who are working in the system under immense pressure, who are seeking to do their best in those very difficult circumstances.
And lots of Christians.
Yeah, many will be in our
the
churches.
healthcare
Yeah,
system.
absolutely. Yeah.
And we should also remember that in the historical scheme of things, and compared to many places around the world, the healthcare that we have available to us for free is remarkable. In comparison with those living in the vast majority of the world. I don't know what the answer is. So that questions are raised of whether or not there need to be structural reform in the way that the NHS works. People comment on the amount of money that's paid into the NHS. So in comparison, countries like Germany and most of Europe spends about 30% more on healthcare than we do in the UK. I mean, at one level, we have a remarkably efficient healthcare system in terms of what it delivers at the sort of relatively lesser cost that we pay for it. How, as a society, are we going to take care of those who are sick and vulnerable? I mean, I do think there's an opportunity for the church here. Many of the issues of social care, some of the causes of illness are bound up with kind of loneliness and lifestyle. Christians have the opportunity to serve their community and perhaps meet some of those needs. Obviously, we as Christians have a long history of wanting to care for the sick, care for the vulnerable, care for the elderly. And maybe there's an opportunity for the church to be able to do that. At the same time, we need to realise that in the end, physical health is not an idol to be kind of worshipped. I think we do, in a secular society, we worship physical health. We forget that kind of decline and death are an inevitable part of human life. And that we have a hope that goes beyond that. And in the end, it's not the case that every medical condition can be treated for everybody. That's just simply not possible. And we need to hold out the greater hope of the gospel, which is of an eternal life and ultimate resurrection into a new creation in which there is no sickness.
Adrian, can I pick up with you? You mentioned there, and you're right, lots of folk in our churches work for the NHS. How can we pastorally support those who are perhaps finding work extremely difficult at the moment? It feels draining.
In a previous podcast, we talked about striking, actually, so we won't repeat that. It's worth going back to that, how you deal with that in a church life when people are striking and whether that's right or wrong and those sorts of questions. And there may be animosity between people in church. I think if you see someone striking and you're ill, for example, that might cause division and disagreement at some level. So I think that needs to be pastorally managed. I think on the whole, aside from a very few people at the top, health and care workers are reasonably poorly paid. And I think they do need love and they do need care. They often need provision and help. I think my sister's a nurse in an oncology ward. I have a grandchild who's often very sick and in Great Ormond Street. So I see the other side of this. And I know that it's extraordinarily emotionally draining dealing with sick people and being in caring professions, whether that's in healthcare or social care. And so I think actually we need to be making sure that people are looked after pastorally. We need to not underestimate the emotional trauma actually of dealing with death, of dealing with people who are sick, dealing with people who are angry. You can work a long shift and come home, and then we're saying, make sure you're at the prayer meeting straight away. We've got to be kind and compassionate and understand the kinds of pressures that people are under. I think that's really important. But I think there's another leadership lesson, Phil, if I may, which is I'm not quite with John here. I think the issues are largely systemic. So I think they're worsened by the situation, for example, like COVID. But if you look at any of the metrics across countries who have all suffered from COVID and all have ageing populations, we score pretty low in developed countries. So out of the 20 top developed countries, our health outcomes, and we're 17th in the league. We've got 135,000 vacancies in the healthcare system, which is an extraordinary number. And so I think there are systemic issues. And one of the challenges for our political leaders is I think they're not very good at dealing with root issues. It's just too difficult. Or if it's too difficult, it requires too long a time frame. And I can understand that. And so the clamour is always, let's put more money in. And we have done that. And we do that every winter. But actually, I think some of those systemic questions are actually difficult to address, but are important to address. And there is a leadership lesson there, because I think as we look at church life, and as we try and think clearly about church life, and we try and think wisely and in a godly way about church life, sometimes it's just easier to operate at the margins instead of grappling with really big things. Is our church in the right place? We got a story in Pray for 100 about a church that decided they're in the wrong place. Well, that's massive. Sell a building, move to another place, so that they're able to fulfill their mission that God has given them. I mean, that's massive and good for them for tackling a really big root issue. And I think part of the problem we have as leaders is we don't allow ourselves enough space and time and energy to think about big ticket items and actually grapple with them. And I think... I think that's always going to be a problem with the NHS.
Go on.
I came across a great quote from a former president of the European Commission who basically said, we know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to win an election when we've done it. And I think that actually summarises one of the challenges of a kind of leadership. At one level, tough decisions need to be made. But actually, the consequence of that is you won't necessarily gain popularity.
Absolutely. I spoke to an NHS contractor who said exactly that. He said the NHS needs to be removed from political grip. And that's the only way you'll fix it over the long term. But because a parliamentary cycle is only 5 years,
when it was imagined, there were no MRI machines that cost however many millions each. So the world is very different. And I think, in church life, we're living in a culture which is very different. We're not in the 1950s. We are in the 21st century. And actually, sometimes as leaders, we have to take tough decisions and lead the church through tough decisions about what church looks like and how it's structured and how it operates in a way that really serves people. And I think we're probably not very good at doing that.
I think we talked about NHS staff, but I don't think we should forget those who are working in care homes and the social care there. It's not just the NHS, they get all the attention, but I think those who are serving and looking after people in care homes are doing a remarkable job and actually are often very badly paid. And actually for churches, there's an opportunity for churches to, I think, build relationships with local care homes, perhaps adopt a care home, pray for a care home, serve in a care home, provide spiritual support to those in there. So there are ways in which churches can perhaps gain meaningful connections more easily with care homes than perhaps they can with the local hospital. And that might be a way in which churches can serve their communities.
Let's take a bit of a curveball as we draw to a conclusion and talk about another kind
Baseball?
of... a healthcare story, really.
Okay. I thought the curveball, literally.
Brothers, are you doing veganuary or dry January?
No.
Yeah, well, you know this, Phil.
Go on.
That I always give up chocolate. New Year's resolution. And I
don't think I did know that.
I try and last till Easter.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So until you crack open an Easter egg, you're off chocolate?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that's extraordinary. And how do you get on?
Pretty well, most of the time, yeah.
Most of the time.
There was once when I was taken out for a meal on New Year's Day, and someone served me chocolate ice cream and I forgot, and I was tucking into it, and my three daughters
it in like 3 hours.
gleefully pointed out that this was a world record.
Did they wait for you to do it and then they knew it was coming?
Yeah, and they just laughed at me, and then they'd bring it up every New Year's Day. That's what children are for.
Yeah, that's right.
Humble.
Point out your faults. It's an interesting thing, though, isn't
People
it?
will now send me chocolate in the post, which is fine. I don't mind that story.
Joel was saying that most of these kind of resolutions last 21 days. So the 21st of January is the average for how people get on with this. But it does say something quite interesting about the human psyche, doesn't it?
Because
essentially, because dry January, veganuary, you're basically denying yourself, aren't you? This is a self-denial thing, which is actually a Christian principle in lots of ways. It's a fascinating thing.
I think it's, why are people doing that? Why are they denying self in that way or trying to? And I think the answer is because they know something's not right. So I think it reflects actually an unspoken recognition that actually I'm not as I should be. I'm either drinking too much or I'm eating too much or I'm eating too much meat or whatever it may be. I'm not going to the gym enough. I think all of those kinds of resolutions reflect an inner-built sense that actually something's wrong. And I don't think that's a deeply spiritual thing. I think that's part of the way we're made. We realise actually we're not operating at the level we should, and there is something that we've done about that and something we need to fix. So I think it's a very interesting... It's a very interesting insight, really, I think, into the human nature. I mean,
it is, in some sense, an alternative religion in a secular culture. So the pattern of feasting and fasting was part of the church's life, reflecting on a kind of sin, our relationship with God. And essentially, it's just different things that have taken the place of that. So it's kind of well-being, it's health, it's environmentalism. In a secular world, those are the things that people are living for. Those are the causes that they're pursuing, both personally and at a collective level. And these are the rituals of the worship of the participation in that religion. That's not to say it's right or wrong to be concerned about those things, but I think in a secular culture, these are becoming more and more the new liturgies, kind of the new, kind of, as it were, church year of the kind of the secular. Yeah.
That's the supermarkets,
world.
Isn't it? So veganuary starts being advertised just after Christmas, and for example, and all the products are on special offer.
And you're giving up chocolate just when the Easter eggs are in.
Yeah, so it's mini eggs in. Yeah.
And at one level, I guess the reason I've not taken part of this, and my general approach is to be kind of moderate all the time. I don't sort of kind of the indulgence and then sort of self-denial. I want to aspire to a kind of a sort of a balanced.
That is true.
Most of the time,
salad and sardines is your standard lunch.
But I've seen you with a coffee, John. I've seen you with a coffee.
So the idea of dry January. Well, that assumes that a whole load of people have actually overindulged, kind of over the Christmas period, and those two things go together. So,
do you want a little snippet of information about Christmas?
Go on.
Because this will be in time for next Christmas. It always comes around, doesn't it, that Oliver Cromwell wanted to ban Christmas and did ban Christmas. And I've been reading a book about Oliver Cromwell and the Republic called The Restless Republic. And two interesting facts. One is, of course, it wasn't Oliver Cromwell that banned Christmas, it was Parliament. The second is that the one day was replaced with 12 public holidays, one each month. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
No.
You probably knew that.
I didn't know that.
So the 12 days of Christmas were one day every month for the whole of the year.
It wasn't that he was a killjoy in that sense. He was trying to sort of remove some of the excess, but actually do good to people. So when next year that trope gets removed, it gets rolled out.
You can sound really clever at
there you go.
The church quiz.
We're here to help.
We're both reading about Cromwell. You're obviously reading a history book. I'm reading Robert Harris's Act of Oblivion, which is a great novel.
Oh, yes. Well, there you go.
Well, I've just finished reading a book called Panic as Man Burns Crumpets, but that's a story for another day. Everything in moderation, I think, John, is your kind of final message.
Well, it's not just that everything in moderation. God gives us good gifts to enjoy.
He does.
And actually, those things include some of the things that people do take into excess. So it's not just that, everything in moderation is a kind of a worldly mantra, but actually it is to enjoy responsibly. That's another worldly mantra, isn't it? But it's to enjoy responsibly what God has given us.
And let's do that as we go through 2023. I keep trying to round this off. John, go on.
I was going to say, it's interesting. I think the whole issue of fasting is really interesting as we go into kind of the New Testament. That God's people fasted when they were in exile, when they were under judgment. There is a sense in which in Jesus we kind of celebrate the coming. So there's not a great emphasis on fasting as a New Testament spiritual discipline, I think.
On that bombshell.
With that theological bombshell, it's time to end. Brothers, thank you very much. Good to catch up and to see you again. And as we go to the Hub, if this is out before the Hub starts, do pray for us this weekend and for those who are attending. This has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. Do rate, leave a review, share it so others can find it, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you.